First of all, again, just to reiterate, you're all very welcome to today's session on surviving the Viva, and in particular, a very warm welcome to students from Ulster University. I'm delighted that you've joined with your colleagues in the University of Limerick today, and hopefully we'll have a very engaging and insightful session. And a huge part of this webinar will be reliant upon your input, which we'll have through the breakout rooms and later in a plenary discussion. Okay, so just to begin, I'll just take you through what the outline of today's session is, just to, with regard to the Viva itself. Sometimes I say Viva Voce, but so I intermingle that with Viva, so it's the same thing that we're referring to. So I'm just going to talk about the purpose of the exam, preparation for the Viva itself, just possible questions that can arise. And again, these questions would be somewhat germane or somewhat generic to you all, but they would be typical questions that one could expect in a Viva, no matter what the discipline is. Just to talk about the role of the examiners and what their function is and the examination panel, because I realize for some of you doing the Viva, you may not be familiar with the kind of the setup that is in place with regard to the configuration of the examination panel. We're then going to have a breakout session in which we'll get a lot of your input and just have a little exercise for you there to do. Then we're going to talk about the examination process itself and what that actually entails. We'll look then at possible outcomes, and I realize we'll be looking at possible outcomes here from the University of Limerick, so it would be interesting to see if there's a difference, or if you like, qualitative or a substantial difference with the possible outcomes in place in Ulster University. Then I'm just going to give you a checklist which you may find useful before the Viva itself. It's just things that you could tick off just to make sure that you fulfill those before the Viva. Again, there's no obligation whatsoever for you to follow that. And then there are some top tips and just some references as well, and I'll just give you a reference to the guide to the Viva Voce for doctoral students here at UL, and then just a couple of links to various articles and to various little clips and vlogs that people have done with regard to the Viva, because if you go onto YouTube, for example, you'll find an amazing array of resources with regard to the Viva itself. But again, it can have a very different format. In some jurisdictions, for example, if you look online, you can even see a Viva that has been recorded. And this usually is in a jurisdiction such as, for example, in the Netherlands or in Belgium, where the Viva itself is more of a ceremonial process, where the student has more or less been given the green light and told that their thesis is successful, and that there is the Viva itself, but the Viva is more ceremonial. For you, it's an examination process, and I guess that is a really substantial difference with other jurisdictions. And there are other kinds of differences as well, which we'll see throughout the Viva today. For example, in some jurisdictions, for example, within the United States, it's very common for a supervisor to be on the examination panel, which is not the case, obviously, here at the University of Limerick, and I'm sure that's the case also in Ulster University. And again, there are other types of differences with regard to the Viva. For example, in some institutions, there is no obligation to have a chair. A chairperson at the Viva, but the role of the chair is actually very important, and that is certainly the case here at the University of Limerick, that the chair has a very significant role. Well, it can be a significant role, hopefully not too significant, but the chair has an important role, at least in the Viva process. So what we're going to have then at the end of the session is just your report back from the breakout session. So we'll go through these and then have the breakouts. We'll go through the first 4 elements of today's webinar and then go to the breakout session. And as I say, if you have any queries or questions, my colleague Anne O'Dwyer is here, and Anne will collate any of the questions that you may have and feed them back to me, because I can't actually see the chat box at the moment. It's one of these little quirks with Teams when you're presenting with the full screen and the red border around it. But at the same time, so Anne will collate any questions, but what you can do at any stage is just unmute your microphone, and if you have a query or an observation or a comment to make, you're very welcome to intervene. Okay. So let's go on with this session. So this is just the scenario that was in place, before COVID-19. Obviously, it was a face-to-face Viva. But for some of you, at least, this is the kind of scenario that you will face. And this is a recording of a Viva that took place. I think this was in the Netherlands, which is why it's a more ceremonial type of Viva, which is why you have so many people there in the session, so many people as examiners and as interrogators or questioners of the candidate. So for you, at least here in the University of Limerick, you will have only 2 people who ask you questions on the day, obviously the internal and external examiner. But I realize that some of you will be facing an online Viva. Hopefully we can get back to face-to-face Vivas hopefully by the summer, by some stage this summer. But really trying to predict what will happen with COVID-19 seems to be making fools of us all. So hopefully that will be the case. But I imagine that for some of you, at least, even when we do return to some kind of normal, or what we called normality in the future, when we return to that, I imagine that it will still be the case that you will still have the option, at least, of a virtual or an online Viva, as well as having the option of having it face to face. Okay, so Viva Voce, or live voice, is basically your defense of what you have written. There are a number of elements behind it, obviously. Now, in terms of the literature itself, some people say this is Burnham and Morley. They say that the Viva itself is mysterious, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a lot of unknown things that you should familiarize yourself with in advance. And that might be overstating it to say that it's mysterious, because I think with so many people having gone through the process, I think it has been somewhat demystified. Unpredictable, but again, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is always the case, and certainly it's unpredictable. When Rugg and Petra wrote this, what they were referring to was the fact that, no matter how well prepared you are, there will always be some question that you haven't anticipated. So it doesn't mean that it's going to be a great jolt to you and a great shock to you, the Viva itself. It just means that some of the questions that you may get could be ones that you haven't anticipated. But hopefully today's session might give you some pointers just in terms of how to anticipate a certain line or certain types of questioning. And Delamont and et al. Said that it's potentially frightening. Yes, I would say, I know before I did my Viva that I was somewhat terrified at the prospect, because I just didn't know what to expect at the time. And but frightening, I'm not sure, because it's potentially frightening for some, but it's also a great experience. You'll find, the vast majority of you will find the Viva to be an absolutely exhilarating and fantastic experience. Hard as though that might be to believe now, but because it will represent one of the few opportunities in your life to talk about your research in great depth and at great length. And so it's also, if you like, a potentially very enjoyable experience. But yes, I just put that in there. This is almost like the worst kind of scenario possible, that it would be potentially frightening. Yes, it's good to be nervous in advance, but think of it also as a potentially very enjoyable experience. I know many people think, how could it possibly be enjoyable? But it can be. Okay, so just in terms of how long it takes, most Vivas tend to take between an hour and 2 hours. So that would be the norm. It's very, very unusual. Certainly in the University of Limerick for a Viva, I've never heard of a Viva lasting less than 1 hour at the University of Limerick, but so on occasion they do. And this was data that was collated from, I think this was from the Sutton Trust in the UK, and it showed that more than a quarter of Vivas were less than an hour, which would be quite unusual at the University of Limerick. And between 2 and 3 hours, 15%. So this is data collated from the UK. So you can expect your Viva to be between 1 and 2 hours on the whole. That is what it usually would take. And again, it would be unusual for a Viva to go beyond to go beyond 2 hours. That would be. It doesn't mean that there's a problem with the thesis, but it just means that that perhaps the examiners have interrogated to the point of repetition. But on occasion, it doesn't necessitate more than 2 hours, but it would be somewhat unusual. And just to let you know in advance of your own Viva, that if your Viva does go beyond 2 hours, that the chair is obliged to offer you a water break. And a break of any kind, so that you can just relax. You don't have to take the option of the break, but it's something that the chairperson is mandated to do. So again, I would say for the vast majority of you that your Viva will be between 1 and 2 hours. And there have been cases where a Viva has lasted more than 3 hours. This usually tends to happen with a problematic Viva. So hopefully yours will never ever reach that point. Okay, so just about the purpose of the exam itself. And again, what I'm giving you today is a kind of a synopsis of a lot of the literature that's been collated and my own experiences of the Viva, and what students have fed into various surveys about the Viva Voce itself. But Potter, for example, back in 2006, identified 3 critical functions of the Viva. And again, you can take issue with what Potter says here, because I think it's good also, as PhD students, to approach any kind of literature with a critical lens. So just even when we hear Potter or read about somebody like this author talking about 3 critical functions of the Viva, I think one of the most important functions is actually left out of this piece of literature. But just if you can just think of what this person says. One, Potter says, is to check that the thesis is really the candidate's own work. And obviously, the Viva process is to test the authenticity and the validity of the thesis. 2, to test the ability of the student to defend their work. And 3, that it's an opportunity for the students to clarify aspects of process and to clear up any misunderstandings, because you'll find that there may be instances, where something which has been somewhat mysterious to the examiners can be, it's an opportunity for you to clarify any misconceptions that the examiners may have about a particular aspect of your thesis. So it's a good opportunity to clarify or to crystallize any kind of misunderstandings that the examiners might have with regard to the thesis itself. But I would say also, that there's a really another very, very important function with regard to the Viva, and that is, what I see is, if you like, the essence of a PhD thesis, and that would be this issue here about your thesis being a contribution to knowledge. So it's also, if you like, the function, I would say, of a thesis is also to verify that your thesis is making a contribution to knowledge, a contribution to literature, a contribution to method, whatever it may be, but that it's making a contribution to the field. So I would say, and again, you'll have an opportunity here in the breakout rooms because it's part of that little exercise I'm going to give you, but to talk about what the contribution of your thesis is. And it's one thing, if you like, to be able to think about it, but and to have it written, but what the examiners want to hear is you being able to articulate and to express what that contribution is. And it's almost, I suppose it's almost inevitable that you will get a question on contribution, because that, if you like, is in so many ways the essence of what a PhD is about. It's about a contribution to knowledge. I sometimes talk about, the epistemic shift that you make as a researcher from going through this stage of, say, being primarily an absorber of knowledge to being a creator of knowledge. So it's about contribution and what new knowledge has been generated, or what new theory has been generated, what new aspect of theory has been generated, or what. So it's about your contribution to knowledge. So you'll have a chance in the breakout rooms to discuss this among yourselves, and be very interested to hear about the discussions. I'll be popping in and out to the various breakout rooms to eavesdrop on your discussions. So that is, I guess, the essence of what a PhD is about, and that's what distinguishes a PhD from other levels of qualification. So here in this jurisdiction, we call it a level 10 qualification, a PhD, a doctoral degree, but it just that is what I would regard as the essence of a PhD, a contribution to knowledge. So contribution, or a contribution to your field. So think also of how you can bring in other work in your field, and just think of how you can relate what your contribution is just to other work, and so just think about what distinguishes your thesis from what has gone before, because that is really important with regard to not just with the Viva, but that is something which you'll have to articulate, or should have articulated, or would be expected to articulate, I would argue, in the thesis itself. So just before the Viva, in terms of preparation, and obviously you'll all be at various different stages with regard to the Viva. Some of you may have submitted your what we traditionally call the softbound copy of the thesis, or just you've submitted the copy for examination. I realize some of you may just have started quite recently and maybe first year PhD students, but even so, even if you are a relatively new doctoral researcher, it's still worth contemplating what preparation you should go through before the Viva itself. So I would say that if you have submitted your Viva, if you have submitted your thesis recently, I hope you've taken a break from the thesis itself, and to give your mind a chance just to rest from thinking about it incessantly. But it's always good to come back before the examination itself, and in good time before the examination, and just to reread your thesis with a critical or with an emotionally detached lens. And that is very hard to do. I found this really, really difficult to do, because, for me, my thesis, it was like my child, like my baby. It was like something that I had brought into the world. And so it was very, very difficult to read it in an emotionally detached and a cold and a clinical way. But it's important to try and do that, to detach yourself from it. Again, I would say that when it comes to proofreading a thesis, I always think that And again, I'm not sure what empirical evidence there is to back this up, but in terms of being a proofreader, I'm a pretty average, I would argue, proofreader of my own work, and I think a lot of us tend to be not very objective as proofreaders. So I remember before I was rereading my thesis for the Viva. First of all, I was somewhat surprised at some of the things that were in it, only because they seem to be so old and seem to be, some things were written almost 4 years before, and so there was a little bit of anxiety thinking back. Oh my God, what was I thinking when I wrote this particular piece here in the thesis? But it's always what I found very difficult to do was to detach myself from the thesis, and I would find myself virtually skimming over various parts of the thesis while I was rereading it, almost as if, well, I know what's coming up here, so I don't need to read. I know exactly what was written here, so I don't need to to look at it with with a great deal of rigor. But you'll find that you probably will not be a very good. You may not be a very good proofreader of your own work, but it's an important element, or an important thing to do, to try and detach yourself from the thesis itself. And again, when you've invested so much of your time and your energy and your own mental health into the thesis, it can be very, very difficult to kind of detach yourself from it and treat it like it's something that's extraneous or external to yourself. But it's important to read it with a critical eye, and to detach yourself from it, and to read it like you imagine the examiners would read it. Again, it's a bit of a skill to actually do that, but it's important to do so. I would say to try and review. What's a good idea is to try and review each chapter. Sorry, one moment. To review each chapter and try and summarize the main points of the chapter, but don't, try not to obsess over each line. But I would say just review, just try and summarize each chapter as you go along, and just try and reflect on what you did and why you did it and how you did it, what the results were and what the implications were of those, of what you did, why you did, how you did it, and what you found. So just think of what the implications of all those are. So that is something I think is just important to do before the Viva itself. Rereading the thesis, just to give you more information about this, this is just a number of quotes from the literature about refamiliarization. Watts, for example, says that refamiliarization with the context, with the research questions, with the literature, with the key findings, and with the conclusion, Watts says, should be a primary aim. And without this, you're unlikely to be able to offer an adequate defense of your work. So it's very, very important that you reread the thesis. So whatever you do, make sure you've reread the thesis in advance of the Viva, whether you can do so with an emotionally detached or a somewhat, critical lens, is each person's prerogative. But I would say it's very important that you actually are very familiar with your thesis before, and refamiliarize yourself with the thesis before the Viva. I think that's really, really important, and I would expect all of you to do so. It's common sense just to do that. Hartley and Jory, for example, say that knowing your thesis inside out is a vital component of effective preparation, and you'll find that that you will know your thesis inside out if you do reread it. And rereading it should also help you to focus on areas of what could be potential debate or points of tension within the thesis itself, be it to do with things like literature or with method. So it's just always good to reread it, so it'll give you, so you'll be able to focus on what are particular points of tension or particular points of debate or areas of contestation. And I talk about this later on, about how examiners will always they'll more than likely focus on what they see as a potential weakness within the thesis and interrogate that, because they'll want obviously clarification with regard to possible points of weakness. So if you reread it and look at where are the points of weakness within the thesis, then that really helps you prepare for the line of questioning that's coming from the examiners, and it helps you then mitigate any kind of tough line of questioning that you get from the examiners themselves. And it just makes sure that you're prepared for, as I said, it's always difficult. As I pointed out earlier, the process can be, it was referred to as unpredictable, meaning that you sometimes can get unexpected questions from examiners. But rereading the thesis and highlighting points of tension and potential areas of debate should really help you then to focus on, possible questions that you will get from the examiners. And in the breakout sessions, I just want to talk about, the kinds of questions that you could get, or just I want you to reflect on the kinds of, the great or the dream questions that you could get, but also the kind of the nightmare questions. So, but by rereading the thesis, it really puts you in a good position when it comes to the Viva itself. And just another point from which I think is just another important element of this discussion is that students who can discuss with clarity and confidence why they use the methods they did, why alternatives were rejected, and what practical and ethical challenges they encountered will impress examiners. And again, I talk about this later on, just about, when you talk about methods that you used, it's also important to know what other methods were available to you, and why they were not used, and why they were, why they were rejected. Because you'll also find, for example, when it comes to things like, in terms of theoretical framework, for example, what you'll find is that with the same research topic, it can be approached differently with a different approach. And there are examples, for example, in English literature, if you take an example, if you look at something through, say, for example, Marxist literary theory, as opposed to, say, for example, postmodernist literary theory, then you're going to get a somewhat different angle and a very, very different approach. And similarly, in psychology, if you're looking at something from a psychoanalytical approach, say, compared to a behavioralist approach, you're going to get, a different, you'll have different methods and assumptions which are used in those two approaches. So you may end up with a very, very different interpretation of the same, of the same evidence. And that is why you have to be able to justify, the methods that you use, the approach that you use, and why you didn't choose other kinds of approaches and other kinds of methods. Okay, so I would say, just before we go into the breakout rooms, I would say when it comes to preparing for the Viva itself, I would say identify, the highlights of your thesis. So think about the points that you think are particularly strong. Again, just summarize each chapter. I'd say think of the key arguments in each chapter. Also the key work cited, but you'll be very familiar with these. And think also perhaps of the rationale for each chapter. Why did you write? Why did you approach this chapter in this particular way? Or what was the rationale behind the writing of this particular chapter? So just try and summarize that before you go in, and that will really help you. Just in terms of preparation, I always think that what's really important is just to write this down before you go in, because it's not just enough, I think, or I didn't find anyway, that it was enough just to write it, just to have it in my head before going in, because if I'd kept it in my head, I think I would have become somewhat muddled in my thinking. But I think what would really help is if you can, when you're trying to think of how you summarize your chapter, and the key arguments and the key work cited, it's always good to write those down beforehand. I find anyway, by writing something down, I can remember it so much better than merely by reading or by scanning it. So I think that's uh, just something to keep in mind. You know, when you are summarizing your chapter and trying to identify things like the highlights of your thesis, or think of why you used particular methods or a particular approach, rather than a different, you know, rather than other methods or another approach, just think of, well, write those down, I would say, beforehand. That would be my advice anyway, because I think you will remember those things so much better. And also, by writing anything down just helps you to clarify. You may have, you know, you may be somewhat frightened of particular aspects of the thesis, or just, and we'll come to nightmare questions in the breakout rooms, but just think of, say, you know, by writing down, for example, you know, the worst kinds of questions that you can think you could be asked. What that helps you to do is it just helps you then to be able to deal with them, but also just by having them written down, it just helps you clarify everything so much more. So that would be, I think, a vital piece of advice, is just to write, you know, when it comes to identifying highlights of your thesis or summarizing each chapter and the key arguments, just to have those written down, a little summary of those written down in advance, and you'll feel so much calmer, I think, going into the Viva. And also just think of how will you defend, you know, your research and your research questions and your methods and the methodology used. So just think about those as well. And as I say, if you can, just to write down, you know, think of how, you know, you're going, you know, think of, you know, why you chose your research questions. And again, just to have it written out beforehand, it just will help you clarify all of those things so much better than if they just remain unwritten. If you have a source of feedback from your supervisor written down throughout the PhD, I'd say refer back to that and look then at what we would call just the key turning points, or points in the points in your thesis, you know, where you saw a change or a big turning point, or where you made that shift, you know, what I call that epistemic shift, you know, from an absorber to creator of new knowledge. So all of those things, I would say, are just good to keep in mind. You know, the key turning points, just where you made, if you like, you know, where you made a breakthrough, or the longed for breakthrough that you were thinking about when it came, you know, be it with method, or be it in the literature review, or be it in, you know, your data collection, or in your analysis, or the surprises, the things that surprised you along the way. It's always good to keep those in mind and to write them down before you go into the Viva. And if possible, do a mock Viva. Not everybody wants to do a mock Viva, but it's a good idea, just to kind of simulate the process in advance. And your supervisor is probably the best person to do that with, or your supervisory team. And I would say also, just with your fellow postgraduate researchers, to discuss your research. It's always a good idea to do so. Again, just to kind of summarize the kinds of questions that you may get, you know, you'll usually get something like, what is your thesis about? What did you do in your thesis? That's, you know, looks like a straightforward question. And it's almost inevitable that you will get asked, what did you do in your thesis? And obviously, what was your thesis about? And, you know, what did you find out? You know, what was it that your study, your research revealed? And also, this not always tends to be an important category, but it's just worth considering, and something to reflect on before you go into your Viva, is just, why does your thesis matter? What we sometimes refer to as the so what question. You know, what was the, you know, what is important about this work? You know, what, and again, that comes back to, ultimately, I would argue that comes back to contributions. So, you know, that by doing this, by undertaking this study, by doing this research, you've made a contribution to the, contribution to knowledge, contribution to your field, contribution to method, contribution to theory, etc. So, you know, think about, why does it matter? And that is, sometimes it's referred to as the cynical question, the so what question. So what? Why was this? What was the point of this thesis? And again, that can be a very abrasive or very tough line of questioning. But sometimes you will find that examiners can be somewhat confrontational, or I'll refer to that after the breakout sessions. But just think of, why your thesis matters. And yeah, and again, just before the Viva, just think of why you chose this topic. If you were to start again, how might you approach it differently? What's the main argument within your thesis, and can you summarize it? How did you arrive at your research questions? And think about how the research questions or research question, I've referred to a lot in this webinar series, of how the research question or research questions tends to be an iterative process, something that you're refining and honing continually until you arrive at your ultimate research questions. And again, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the thesis, the limits, because ultimately, you're doing a time-bound piece of work, effectively on your own. So you're not, for the most part, working in collaboration. Yes, you will be in collaboration with your supervisor, certainly, and some of you will be writing collaboratively. But for the majority of you, you'll be doing something which is basically, not involving other collaborators in terms of the writing process, but you will be engaging in a 3 or 4 year project, and effectively writing this on your own. So that in itself is indicative of the limitations of the thesis, because it has to be time bound. You have to say, I can only look at this particular element or this particular aspect of my research question has to be tight, and it has to look at this particular aspect of a particular problem. But so every thesis will have limits, and just think of what your own limits are. It's just a good idea to be kind of armored with that information before you go into the Viva, because what it shows as well is just how you can be an effective critical appraiser of your own work. And critical appraisal and critical thinking obviously are expected attributes and characteristics that doctoral students are expected to have. And again, why did you choose this methodology or this particular research design? How did the thesis change along the way, and why? And inevitably, your thesis will change. So why did it change? Where would you place yourself in your field? That can be a question. I think this was a question in my Viva. Where would you place yourself in your field? And who are the other key players? So I would say the Viva is an opportunity to explain your research. You should, by the time you get to the Viva, be the leading expert on your niche area or on your topic. The examiners, even though they may appear confrontational, or one of them may appear confrontational at times, they want you to do well. Ultimately, nobody wants you to fail before you go into the examination itself. Your thesis will never feel finished. I sometimes quote that director of that film who said, "They took my film from me." This director who said, that never did he feel that a film was finished. So your thesis will probably feel like that as well. You will never feel finished. You'll never actually be happy with the end result, or some of you maybe, but that would be quite unusual. You'll always feel there's some aspect that could have been, somewhat improved, or some aspect that you perhaps left out a piece of literature that you would like to have referred to. So it will never feel completely finished, but that is perfectly normal. And everyone at a Viva encounters issues, even people who get the best of recommendations. There'll always be some. I've seen people who delivered a brilliant thesis but get a really hard Viva on occasion. Thankfully not too often, but this can happen. And I know somebody who did a Viva and was very upset by the confrontational nature of the Viva. It was in an institution that didn't have a chairperson, which was a big problem, because then this poor person had a pretty traumatic experience of just dealing with two examiners and no independent chair to arbitrate or to ensure that the line of questioning taken, was more confrontational than it should have been. And at the end of which, the candidate was told, "Oh, your thesis is a brilliant piece of work. We were just testing you to see, that it's as brilliant as we think it is." So, you may find yourself in that kind of scenario. And again, I don't mean to frighten you, because you can find that as I said, the Viva should be a very, very enjoyable experience, but for some people it's not. But I think what we at least realize in UL at the University of Limerick is that, so important to have a chair, and a good chair. And we always insist that the chairs, go through and undertake some kind of training before they chair a Viva, so that they know, if there is a difficulty to be encountered, that they can arbitrate that in a very, very fair manner, and just to make sure that the candidate gets a fair hearing. So the chairperson has a really important role, but everybody will encounter issues in a full, just in terms of, say, the kinds of scenarios that you can depict, or the kind of, hopefully it'll help you to reflect a bit, reflect more on the contribution that your thesis will make, to the field. I've a lot in the slides, but I'm very conscious of the time also. So what I'll just go through here, before we just have a short discussion at the end, is just a kind of a quick checklist just on the Viva itself. So I've skipped out a number of issues, but I think that a lot of them will be very, will be self-evident, or it's a lot of ground that we've covered already, particularly in regard to the examiners. It has some pointers there also, just about methods and methodology, and the types of questions that you can expect to get. But we have in GPS, my colleague Michael Frame put together a really, really good guide to the whole Viva Voce process, and I'll just give you the link to that at the end also, because that has a list of a lot of the hypothetical questions and the kind of scenarios that you might confront in the Viva itself. But I'd say just if it was to summarize today's talk, just before we get on to your discussion, I would say just we have a checklist here just of things that you could do before the Viva itself, and these are just some of the things that you could just mark off before you go in preparation for the Viva. Just think of, have you reread your thesis and know it thoroughly? I'd say also it's a good idea to write a short summary of each chapter. Think about how your thesis fits into the discipline. Make sure, even since submission, you may find that you submit your thesis and then it could be 2, 3, 4 months before your Viva. And just think of any kind of literature, any relevant literature that has come up since submission, because it might be no harm to impart that and to discuss that with the examiners on the day of the Viva itself. And just think about the implications, of your research, what the implications are to theory and practice. And it's a good idea also to have a mock Viva with your supervisors, primarily with your supervisors, but if you can find other colleagues or friends that could help you with a mock Viva, that would be a really, really, really good help. It's also good to talk about your thesis to non-specialists and think of how you can communicate your research to a non-specialist audience also. I would say, this came up in one of the breakout rooms, I would say it would be important to read some of the publications, particularly of your external examiner. Your external examiner is like to be the person with more specialist knowledge of your particular field, so of your particular topic. So I would say it's important to read their publications. Also, just look at the regulations that are there, and there's a link obviously in the and more information about the regulations in the guide that as I mentioned, Michael Frayne put together. But this is it's also good to look at your own university regulations and to see what has changed, in fact, because you'll find out that since the pandemic, perhaps some of the regulations pertaining to online Vivas in particular have changed. And then just a list of questions, including nightmare questions. And as I say, just getting you to think about the nightmare questions and writing those down beforehand, I think is a big help, because then it just allows you, it just puts you more at ease going into the Viva itself. And just think of areas where you are likely to be challenged. What would be, say, kind of the possible weak points in your thesis where the examiners might pick up on, and what areas could they challenge? I hear somebody talking about methodology earlier, and how that could be, a nightmare scenario for them. So like that, all those, they're really, really useful to discuss and to think about, and to write those down in advance. What are the areas in which you're likely to be challenged? It's also good, you're free to bring a copy of your thesis to the Viva and to mark, so if you have a printed copy, what's always very good is just to have it marked, to have certain sections marked in advance or tabbed in advance, so that you'll be able to make reference to those when it comes to the Viva itself. Your examiners might say, in chapter 3, I want you to explain more about your choice of research methods, and they say I have a question about this particular aspect of it, and they make reference to page 94 or whatever it may be, and then you can look at that in tandem with your examiners, and there's nothing to stop you at all from looking at your thesis at any time if it's of relevance to the examiner's questions. Just to give you some, these are like a summary perhaps of what we might call the top tips that you could perhaps take on board before the Viva. Just think about, you'll be able to, or you should certainly have some input with your supervisors with regard to your examiners, and think of people who would be relevant to your field. Maybe it's, for your external examiner, it may be somebody that you've read that you'd like to be examined by a particular expert in your field, and your supervisor then should be able to choose. You'll both know the internal examiner, but the external examiner, that's a big choice. So think, you'll have a chance to discuss this with your supervisor and think about, who you'd like as your external examiner. As I said, can't usually be someone who's a buddy or a friend of yours. That wouldn't be ethical, but it's someone who is an expert in their field. And they are to be chosen for that reason. So in fact, when the choice of examiners is made, that still has to be approved by a panel, by a committee in advance. So it's not the case that if you decide, I want this person as my examiner, that they will always be the person that you get as your examiner. There has to be a justification for why that person is chosen as an external examiner. And as I said earlier, if you have written your thesis recently, or if you're thinking about that your Viva is coming up, and you've or you're going to be finish your thesis in the near future, just take a break from the thesis before the Viva and make sure that you reread it carefully. And I say, arrange a mock Viva. Try and summarize your own thesis's strengths and their weaknesses. Again, keep up to date with the literature, know your examiners, and be aware of alternative approaches, to your study. So as I say, if you're looking at something like, I don't know, Keynesian economics, if you're taking a Keynesian approach as opposed to a neoclassical approach, think of what the alternatives are and how the way that you've looked at an issue. Say, for example, you're looking at the issue of inequality with regard to a Keynesian approach or with a neoclassical approach in economics, you're going to more than likely come up with very different interpretations of inequality by looking at the topic with a particular lens. So just think of the alternative approaches that are in place and why you didn't choose those particular approaches, why the approach and the theoretical framework, for example, and the methods that you've chosen are the best to answer your research questions. And also just think of, answer the questions you are asked. Again, this came up in the breakout room, just where it's important, just that you make sure you don't avoid the question you were asked, because the examiners will pounce on that almost inevitably. So, if you don't know the answer to a question, it's no harm saying I don't know how to answer that, or you can ask for clarification on a question. But but just make sure to answer the questions you were asked. Don't think, oh well, I'm going to address now my strengths here because this is a weak point of my thesis. So just make sure that you answer the question that you were asked. It may seem obvious, but not everybody does so, and it can lead to problems in the Viva. And as I said, bring a copy of the thesis as it was submitted. So even if you feel that you've made changes to it since you submitted it, if you've reread the thesis and went, oh my God, I made a big mistake here, there's a typo there, or just I should have put that paragraph elsewhere, don't change it around. Just for the copy that you bring to the Viva, make sure it's the thesis as it was submitted, because then, when the examiner say, on page 97, you've written this particular point, you can refer to page 97. You don't want to bring in a thesis that has been, modified since it was submitted. And as I say, ask for clarification of any ambiguous questions. If there's anything that you need clarification on, and this is perfectly acceptable. If the examiner you feel has gone, and add this and ask this interminably long question, or just a question in which you need some, or a question is very difficult to interpret, just ask for clarification. There's no problem at all in doing that. And it's a good idea to just take time before you answer the question, just to allow your thoughts to come through, particularly for a question that you're not expecting, that you weren't expecting, that you hadn't anticipated. It's always good just to take some time before you answer that, and to be prepared to ask questions, and to enter into a dialogue with the examiners, because as I said, it's likely to be the case that you'll have a chance to enjoy your Viva, as hard as it might be to imagine, or as hard as it is now to envisage after all the nightmare scenarios that I've talked about, or all the, hopefully I haven't put the frighteners on to any of you, but it can really be a very, very enjoyable experience, ultimately. And, as I said, be ready to admit if you don't know the answer to a question. There's no shame in that. And again, don't be afraid to express opinions of your own. People like to see, a robust exchange of views. I didn't shy away from taking on my own external examiner about an issue, and we had a really good, frank and discussion about it, but a very different interpretation of the same thing. So it was good to have that, to have that exchange. It was at a point where I was beginning to feel more relaxed in the Viva, and but again, examiners, they don't mind you having opinions or strong opinions of your own, and because it's called a defense. You're defending what you've written, and if your examiner wants to denigrate what you've written, you can feel, well, no, that's wrong, and don't be afraid to express that in the Viva. Again, I've just put some references here. There's the Viva Voce guide written by my colleagues at Mike Frayne. There's an article about how to survive a Viva, 17 top tips from The Guardian. There's a number of vlogs from Flinders University in Australia by a remarkable person, Tara Brabazon, the Dean of Graduate Studies at Flinders, who gives these amazing videos on YouTube in her own very, very inimitable style, and quite remarkable, but really, really good advice. So she always has, really excellent pointers for people. So she's got two there about what students need to know about the exam, and what PhD examiners are looking for when they read your references. So when they read your bibliography and the references therein, what they are looking for. And then there's just another short YouTube video from Birmingham University, how to pass your PhD Viva, and 5 top tips there. And the top tips tend to be just distillation of what we've talked about earlier. So